Hi everyone, welcome to episode 55 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. My name is Rohit Bhargava, and each week I interview successful founders, investors, and subject matter experts on how they got started, the strategies they used to succeed, and their advice to current and future entrepreneurs. Just a quick message from me before we get into this episode. On Monday, the 3rd of July, I'll be doing a live podcast event with Vicky Lay, who is the Managing Director at Artesian Venture Partners. Prior to her role with Artesian, she was the co-founder and Chief Operations Officer at Zookle, a local startup which raised funding from Silicon Valley investors and generated $20 million in revenue last year. If you're in Melbourne on the 3rd of July, I would love to see you there. You can register for the event by heading to tinyurl.com/playbookvicky, and I'll also include the link in the show notes for this episode at startupplaybook.co. So coming back to episode 55, my guest for this podcast is Aris Allegos. He first left his corporate career in the 90s to launch his first venture, ToyBox, Australia's first online toy retailer, which he sold after just 9 months. He then spent the next 15 years in the world of corporate finance and is now the co-founder and CEO of Moula, an online platform that streamlines the process of getting loans between $5,000 and $250,000. Moula raised a Series A round of funding of $30 million and was one of the first startups to lead the rise of the Fintech space in Australia. In the episode, we talk about how to build the right team, the value of bootstrapping, how to approach risk, how to stay ahead in a competitive market, and the challenges of scaling a company. Without further ado, here is my interview with Aris Allegos. Hi Aris, welcome to the Startup Playbook Podcast, and thanks so much for taking the time to be here today.
Pleasure, Rohit. Thanks for having me.
No problem at all. So for those people that may not be as familiar with you or your background story, do you want to share a little bit of your background and what got you here today?
Yeah, sure. So safe to say I am not the 28-year-old entrepreneur. I wish I was, but I got a little bit more experience under the belt. So let me go way back, shall we? Because I think it's been very relevant to sort of how we run Moula and what's kind of transpired, at least in this business, to go back to the start. So started my career with the formerly known Arthur Andersen. So for those of you who are a bit later to the scene, Arthur Andersen was one of the big 5 accounting firms, not dissimilar to the PwCs and the KPMGs, etc. of the world today. And I started within their sort of corporate tax division back in the late 90s, very much off the back of a degree out at Monash, and very, very quickly realised that notwithstanding I had a passion for the corporate world, I also had an itching for the more entrepreneurial pursuits in life, and I think the late 90s were not dissimilar to the environment we're in today and have been for the last couple of years, where there was a bit of a fever pitch in startup land, not so much in Australia, but definitively in the US, where .com 1.0 was well and truly underway, and I got a bit of that bug, if you will, and being relatively early onto the internet with a dial-up modem at home in the sort of the mid-90s and the sort, me and my brother decided sort of around 98 to start an internet toy retailer, which kind of coincided with when I started at Arthur Andersen. So ultimately, one of those had to give, and what gave was Arthur Andersen. It kind of went into what was my first entrepreneurial endeavour, which was running ToyBox.com.au, which was Australia's first internet toy retailer, now long forgotten because probably about 9 or maybe 10 months after starting that business, we sold the business. So it was ultimately my first taste of what was the entrepreneurial spirit. And it was quite unique because you would think, so coming off that experience, you would roll into the next one and the next one like a lot of entrepreneurs do. But what kind of transpired in the early 2000s was the dot-com crash, and a lot of people obviously being spread to the wind when the various opportunities that had existed were no longer there due to funding, etc. So I won't say I was spread to the wind, but I sort of took a bit of a breather post ToyBox and post my time at Anderson's, and decided to go do an MBA. So that was partly to educate myself and partly to jump on a plane and go to London. So I ended up in London, and out of that MBA experience, which was a great experience nonetheless, ended up pretty much with a banking role. Credit markets in the early 2000s were booming, and if you've seen movies like The Big Short and the sort, you'll probably understand what the implications of those credit markets were. But notwithstanding, ended up on a fixed income trading floor in London and had a 14-year or thereabouts sort of career in banking and finance, very much within fixed income, very much within sort of the credit or direct lending side of capital markets businesses within various investment banks, both in London and also in Hong Kong. So just to kind of, long story long it, ended up in Hong Kong for about 7 years, and then came back to Australia at the start of 2013 with a pretty diverse background. And that was kind of the point in time where Moula was born.
Fantastic. Obviously, I'm going to come back to what you're sort of doing with Moula now, but going back to the start of that journey, I'm sure what you were going through at that time is similar to what a lot of listeners are going through at the moment, which is, they're in the corporate space, they've got a job and they're thinking that they want to do something else. What was that sort of, was there a particular moment for you that instigated you wanting to leave and launch ToyBox? And obviously that ecosystem would have been very different than back then to what it is now. So what was that process like for you to get something off the ground?
Yeah, so I think it's relevant both to the experience at Anderson as it is to my experience in Hong Kong and what ultimately became Moula, in that there's always been a cap or a limitation to what you can do within corporate environment. Within a corporate environment, particularly within large businesses, be it Anderson, be it Credit Suisse, etc., you get siloed. And by virtue of being siloed, you become very good at your vertical skill set, if you will. But in terms of having a large breadth of skill, in terms of exploring the many facets of your capability, it's limiting. And I think that was the main sort of psychological barrier I had to corporate, in that I was always very much being sort of driven towards one specific path without having the opportunity to explore the various other paths that are out there. So it's not to say I didn't learn anything or I didn't enjoy my time within the corporate environment. Far from it. And in fact, it's safe to say I learned a lot. But learned a lot within that sort of very thin vertical wafer of expertise that I had embarked upon. And then you ultimately end up in an environment like this one, or like ToyBox, where your breadth of skills and the vastness of what you're required to do changes quite significantly. And I guess that's the refreshing part of it. It's the daunting part of it, but it's also the refreshing part of it, in the sense that you get to explore a bit of everything, and particularly in the early days. So I think it was always the desire to have that breadth and not be pigeonholed that really led to both of those respective initiatives.
Yeah, fantastic. So, I mean, obviously, I've spoken about this with a few other guests on the show, but, we have, as startup founders or people within the startup ecosystem, we have a fairly negative view of the corporate space and of MBAs and formal education and those sort of things as well. And you sort of touched on this in your sort of early response, but what were some of the things that you, applied, whether directly or indirectly, from your experience within corporate and from the MBA into both businesses?
Yeah, I think it is interesting when you do meet some founders who almost frown upon the traditional corporate path or the actual experiences that are obtained out of university, and obviously that's not me. And I have a lot of people asking me for career advice and how they would pursue their progression. And I think the one thing I do say is very much, there's no harm trying the formal route, particularly if you need the funds, i.e. a steady full-time paying job, to get you through the early days, if you will. And obviously for me, that was a necessity whereby to embark upon ToyBox or to embark upon Moula, you needed to have cash in bank because, I didn't have a pot of gold I could dip into to start either business. And, so from a monetary perspective alone, essential. There was no, and these are both businesses very much bootstrap businesses that have not necessarily relied on external funding in their formative sort of time frame. But in terms of like what disciplines came out of corporate life, it was very much the sort of the need to work within a team environment. And there's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who are obviously very focused and very driven in terms of how they pursue their said business. But the one thing I've learned, particularly at Moula in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, is the importance of building a strong team. And you obviously discuss this with a lot of your entrepreneurs, but the importance of building a strong team and making that team work and working effectively within that team. And there's no better place to learn how to do that than in a company that has a couple of thousand people or tens of thousands of people, where you really get to understand what makes people tick and how to manage both upward and downward. And regardless of where you're at in a startup, you have both upward and downward management, insofar as you're still managing your board, you're still accountable to your shareholders as you are responsible for managing your team. So that's something that you can get out of a corporate experience, and likewise out of a business school experience. I think people get confused when it comes to business school between comparing the academic side of things to the sort of the less academic side of things, if you will. And the reason, I guess, you go overseas for an MBA, or you go to an MBA school that perhaps is going to challenge you, isn't necessarily because of the curriculum. It's because of the people you're meeting and the opportunity you have to network and to sort of build out, call it a database of people that might be useful to you in your future life. And there's no doubt about the network effect, and that sort of the importance of the network effect that you get out of an MBA being equally as relevant to building out a startup. And I think most entrepreneurs would refer to their network and the people they've met along that journey as being fundamentally critical with respect to how they've raised funds, how they've built out a team. And that was probably something I took out of the MBA that I didn't put as much focus on prior to, just the importance of fostering that network.
Sure. Speaking of network and speaking of teams, one of the most common things that, as you've sort of touched on, a lot of successful founders and investors have mentioned that they look for is having the right team in place. And that's obviously something that a lot of startup founders, especially first-time founders, really grapple with, is how do I find other people to buy into my project? And through one of our early discussions, you were talking about how one of your co-founders actually left his job and moved to Australia to start the company with you. That's a pretty big step for anyone to take, let alone at those early stages. So how do you find the right team members, and then how do you get them to buy into the vision of what it is that you're creating?
Yeah, I think we've got a really, I won't say unique, I should say we've got a really sort of well-rounded founder team. And I'm always hats off to those founders, particularly those individual founders who start the business themselves and sort of lead it independently. And they're very few and far between, which is why I always find a founding team comprised of, call it 2-3 founders. And I think in our case, it's safe to say everyone has a complementary skill set. So there's neither myself, neither Andrew or peers are sort of running up against each other and duplicating roles, if you will, and building out that founding team in the early days has been absolutely essential to how we have, I guess, run the business and almost inherent in our growth. So just to sort of go into the detail, and you mentioned sort of Piers specifically coming out of London. Piers is our CTO. He's had over sort of 20 years of experience building backends within some very large banks in the UK. Well known to Andrew, who I initially founded the business with, and bringing him has obviously been critical because it's enabled us to have a real tech focus. And I think even though the term is bandied around, Fintech, there's probably a lot of businesses out there that are more fin than tech, in that they are licensing a lot of their tech, or there's not a great focus with respect to some of the more platform specific requirements that sort of come up day to day. Now, that's not the case with us. It's safe to say, because of the fact we have someone like Piers in the business and have had him in the business since day one, there's some really, really sort of core technology in what we've built here domestically that has application throughout the world. But so rounding out the team was obviously Andrew. So I had some credit experience and specifically an understanding of how to underwrite businesses to make a lend, kind of important when setting up a lending business. But similarly, Andrew had the same skill set. We met in London on the fixed income trading floor back in the early 2000s. So you would argue that we had the same skill set and there was no sort of complementary behaviours there. Now, the reality of it is that Andrew has no interest sort of getting out there and necessarily dealing with the marketing and the stakeholder management and the capital raisings and the sort. But it's something that he's happy for me to run with, whilst he's very much an operational guy. He just wants to execute, just get the machine ticking along, and that's where it works really well. So obviously by default, I'm the guy who's left dealing with shareholders and cap raisers and the sort, but that's fine too, because more than happy. That probably speaks more to my skill set, and I think all of us have fallen into these respective buckets of capability as a founding team. And we didn't do it on purpose, don't get me wrong. It's not like we sat there strategically and went, you do this, you do that, etc. With the exception of Piers, obviously, because he's the only one who knows how to code. But we kind of all fell into these very natural roles, and never once have we had an argument over who's responsible for what. Never once have we sort of looked at each other and made comments about who's working harder than the other one. We all do our respective roles, and whenever I do meet founders who are sitting there, with concerns about their other respective founder, my advice to them would almost be just stop now. If you're having those discussions when you're in day 1 or day 4 of your business, you're not going to make it to day 50. But you do hear about it a lot. Hence, it adds to that statistical pool of businesses that don't get past the first year. So it's been quite useful having that founding team from day one.
Yeah, I was going to ask, but you sort of answered the question. Was that when you said that you had people that came on with complementary skill sets? Did that sort of evolve over time? So did you, from day one, did you know that you were going to do particular things, or did that kind of, as you were progressing through the course of the business, you kind of found out what your sort of natural tendencies were more sort of geared towards?
It wasn't necessarily premeditated, that's for sure. I think it in the back of our minds, particularly between me and Andrew, like we probably had a good feel for where things were going to play out, but I'm not the sort of person to force my wishes upon someone, and Andrew vice versa, particularly in the early days. It was very much a case of let's just throw everything up in the air and see where it all lies in the end. And as it transpired, when we were going through our initial seed round, and then from seed round into the round when we bought in Liberty, it just so happened they were relationships that came from me. And hence they were discussions I was leading, and accordingly, I just ended up being the sort of the main guy in that capacity. And because I was tied up doing that, Andrew had no choice but to worry about the day to day and the lending, or he did have a choice, but he chose to embark upon it and did a bloody good job of it as well.
Sure. And so you touched on this a little bit earlier as well, but both ToyBox and Moula were originally self-funded, so you were bootstrapped from the beginning. Can you kind of talk a little bit? Again, a lot of the founders that I see, one of the first questions that they have is, I've got an idea, can you introduce me to an investor, or how do I get funding for my startup? Was that I'm assuming at ToyBox you didn't really have as many opportunities to go seek funding, but for Moula specifically, when you're doing a financial lending business, that you would assume that would be where you would start.
Yeah, it is. It is quite unique in terms of the strategy or the path we've chosen, and in both instances, I think having done it twice now, perhaps I have a leaning towards it or a bias. But in the case of ToyBox, it does go back to the point that I made where I had been working in a corporate environment. That corporate environment gave me the opportunity to put some funds to work to do something that I saw as being a bit more interesting. And keep in mind, this was back in the day where setting up an e-commerce business wasn't a case of getting a big commerce or a Shopify as a SaaS solution in place and paying $100 a month and away you went. We actually had to build both the back end and the front end from scratch, which involved spending the last couple of years money I'd been generating or saving at Anderson's on that sort of platform. So that was a decision, I guess, we made because A, we had the funding, and B, we were extremely naive to what we were doing. And then fast forward, almost 15 years later, 16 years later, and I'm in the exact same spot whereby I guess for me I needed to test the case, if you will, prove the hypothesis before I was going to take someone else's money and perhaps jeopardize their hard-earned wealth and the sort. And I think this is an important mindset for any entrepreneur to have. And I often say this to my team here at Moula. It's like you got to treat the money as if it's your own. So what better way than treating your money as your own when it is your own? And that was the same even for our first seed funder that we brought in. It was very much a case. I didn't want him to part with his money for the business not to be around in 6 months' time. And you do see people raise money and then they're out there sort of having parties and hiring unnecessary heads and resources. It's like, would you do that if it was your own money? And I guess that's always been something inherent in our thinking because of the fact we bootstrapped Moula and ToyBox from day one. So that's been a really important approach to, I guess, the early days of Moula, and couldn't have done it without obviously the support of the two founders as well, and we were all on the hook, and similarly couldn't have done it without the support of all of our respective families, and that's another important one for a lot of your listeners out there. If you're going to embark upon a process like this, make sure you get your respective other half on board, particularly when you're dusting money that could be allocated to other endeavours, i.e. sending your kids to school, renovations, etc., etc. So, there's a big risk that needs to be taken. And again, back to my point about backing yourself and treating the money like it is your money, because it is, absolutely, absolutely critical. And it doesn't always play out, but that's the educator risk you're going to take. And I guess for us, almost 4 years ago, the market wasn't as saturated as it is today. We had the right founding team to get the business up and running. Everything felt right. So it was an educated or calculated risk as opposed to, I'm just going to go spend someone's, hard-earned cash on a little pet project.
Absolutely. I mean, speaking of treating the money as if it's your own, I spoke at Fuck Up Nights. I don't know if you're familiar with the event.
Yep.
Kind of sharing my story with Sage Lab when we actually turned down investment opportunities 3 times before we took on a little bit of seed money. We then tried to scale the business and figured out that the business model was broken. We ended up giving most of the cash back. And someone in the crowd asked me, why did you end up giving the cash back? And that question completely threw me off. Why wouldn't you? What else would you do with the money? Yeah. But speaking of risk as well, what Both times you kind of, especially with ToyBox, of e-commerce being really new and you having to build up a new platform and it just being a very foreign thing at that time. How did you mitigate that risk for yourself? Even looking at Moula now, what were some of the things that you did, or how did you approach that risk?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the short answer is I don't think you can mitigate the risk from a business perspective because there's always going to be risk. I think what you can do is you can learn to live with the risk, and you can learn to, you can learn to sleep at night knowing that it all could fall into an absolute heap the following day. But I guess what you can do to address some of the concerns and help you sleep at night is obviously ensure you got the right people supporting your vision. And I guess to an extent that is mitigating the risk. But again, such a random walk, who knows what's going to happen. But speaking to the founding team, speaking to some of the guys that we've brought into the business since Moula was founded. In the case of ToyBox, I was doing it with my brother, so well and truly a known quantity. Having all of those individuals in place really does help to, go from 4 hours of sleep a night to maybe 6. So I think that's been the key. Again, it always does come down to the team as being a critical success factor, as it does to the timing. And I think it's that Bill Gross YouTube sort of talk that he does where he talks about the 5 factors common to startups, and team's probably number 3, I think, in his mix. And it's probably fair because the timing, i.e. you just timed it right, you got a bit lucky, is kind of what he's saying is critical. So again, speaking of mitigating risk, with ToyBox, it was the sort of internet 1.0. E-commerce was well and truly nascent, so the timing was right. Similarly with Moula, when we started this business, the whole Fintech sort of boom that's transpired over the last couple of years hadn't even started. I remember the first article that got written about us in the AFR didn't even refer to us as a fintech. It referred to us as an online small business lending platform because the term hadn't really even been coined for the relevant journalists to write the point. So again, it was nice being at the front of that, such that when we did start getting track record, such that when we did go out to look for investments in the sort, we weren't dealing in a very noisy landscape and sort of fighting for voice among everyone else. And that clearly had a massive influence with respect to us ticking the box according to Mr. Gross.
In terms of, so I interviewed Paul Naftali as well from Ampersand.
No, Paul, good chat.
He's fantastic, and so one of the things that I know that he's really big on, and I think he wrote an article about this as well, was one of the things that he looks for in startup founders is the need to be extremely optimistic in starting something, balanced with being extremely naive. With things as well, or sorry, not being naive, being extremely optimistic and being extremely paranoid. How do you sort of balance that? As you sort of mentioned, there's no one of the biggest things that I've kind of seen through startup founders is we're all aware of the risk, but we still jump in anyways. And so especially when you've got a team that's around you, and things potentially aren't going that great at the start, and there are so many variables and things could kind of stop very quickly. How do you keep people still engaged, and how do you keep sort of powering through when those doubts sort of creep up?
No, I think Paul's a very articulate chap, and I think he's hit nail on head in terms of sort of really, really defining that requirement. I think the optimism is one that's really easy to maintain, particularly in the early days where you think the world is at your feet, and then particularly once you've closed your seed round or your A round, like it's easy. Optimism comes in spades and away you go. And as I said, I think the challenge is to not then get carried away and go and throw parties and hire heads you don't necessarily need. And that's what people do. They get carried away and suddenly it burns in places where it shouldn't be. So I think that's where the paranoia is really important, because you need to be extremely paranoid that the burn is going to run away from you, or I should say perhaps the revenue isn't going to follow the same trend as perhaps your hiring and your spending is, and then you're in all sorts of pain. And I think that's obviously what Paul's getting at. And that's across many facets of the business, whether not just their financial, but sales, etc. But in terms of maintaining the optimism when perhaps the revenue is taking longer to tick on, or there's a big competitor that's coming to market, whatever the case might be, I'm a real advocate of sort of just digging in, putting the blinders up, and just pursuing that strategy that you've already started, and call it stubborn behaviour. And some people might see that as being a limitation, in that you get very sort of focused on that one path. But if you have a strategy, and it's something you're committed to, you need to see it through. And it's not to say it's going to be right or wrong, but you need to see it through. And then through that journey, you're obviously constantly iterating and assessing its performance. And then when the time's right, you either cut it, move on, or you continue to throw more sort of wood on the proverbial fire, if you will. And I think that's, in terms of maintaining the optimism or maintaining the focus, like that's been really beneficial to us at Moula, in that we're not flip-flopping. And this is in an environment where many startups out there, or many founders out there, are talking about pivoting, and that whole methodology of going chopping and changing. If anything, we've been rather consistent with our strategy here at Moula from day one. Now, it's not to say that we haven't pivoted within how we've focused sales or how we've focused marketing, etc. But that's been more about iterating, and that's kind of enabled us to have some confidence in what we're doing, as opposed to looking at it all and throwing our hands in the air and just closing shop. Because there's no doubt any entrepreneur out there is telling absolute porky pies. If they don't have those experiences where it feels like it's all just getting too hard and you want to pack up shop and go back to your corporate. Like there's no doubt about it. Everyone has them, and what is it? Ben Horowitz calls it the struggle. I think I can't remember the terminology he uses, but he sort of articulates that quite well. And I think it's safe to say the only way we've really gotten through that is just by focusing and getting through. And then I guess it's also a function of when you make a decision, and it's harder in the early days, it's easier today for us, but when you make a decision, that decision needs to be informed. So if I'm going to kill a campaign, or if I'm going to choose not to pursue a certain opportunity, I need to back that up with something tangible, i.e., in a business like ours, the data. That's kind of how it all comes together now, particularly as the business matures. Hard to do that in the early days where you have no data, so you're sort of just making it all up.
Sure. So I guess going back to again, one of your earlier points was, when you were first when you were first launching Fintech as a term didn't exist, as an ecosystem didn't exist, and obviously that's become one of the kind of biggest pillars of the startup ecosystem. And now, obviously, specifically within your space, you've got a lot of competitors that are kind of popping up as well. So, once you've got something established and you kind of hit the nail on the head, how do you then stay ahead of the competitors, or how do you sort of stay relevant in market?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I think in our environment, where there is a lot of noise, not so much 2017, but there was a lot in 2016. I guess the key for us has been, and I mentioned it before, about really sort of putting a lot of focus on the technology and the platform that we've built. and using that to sort of differentiate ourselves from a business model that, let's face it, is 3,000 years old. I mean, that's the really interesting thing about fintech as it applies to lending. This dates back to the Medicis, right? What we're doing isn't exactly a true disruption. If you look at other parts of fintech, and it might be sort of payment facilitators, or it might be insurance tech, or what have you, that might be sort of truly disruptive. What we're doing is just lending to small businesses. So then how do you differentiate yourselves within the segment and within fintech broader? And I think, for us, and because of what we've built and our partnerships that we have, whether it's with Liberty, whether it's with Xero, whether it's with Officeworks, there's some really key partnerships we've built up along the way. It's enabled us, or proven to us, that what we have is quite unique. So notwithstanding there are competitors out there, we're very conscious of the fact that a lot of those platforms, albeit all due respect, some good platforms out there, don't necessarily have what we have from a tech perspective. Now, I guess the question then sort of pops up is, well, what's so good about your tech? Now, I could bore you ad infinitum on that in terms of what I think we've built that makes the platform world class. But ultimately, our goal is to do one thing, and that's to service the customer. And this sort of comes back to all your other standard kind of business reading, if you will, about providing a customer experience that's relevant and that's easy to use is the key of what we do day in, day out. And that's where the real benefit of the technology comes from. In that we've built something that is unique to Australia, or unique to any business that operates within a non-comprehensive credit reporting regime. And I won't go into all of that because that'll absolutely bore your listeners senseless. But there's a real sort of tech piece there that helps the customer get a loan in an environment where they're sitting on cloud accounting software, or where they've got their bank transaction data sitting with their respective bank, and we make it easy so that data can be provisioned. But we make it easy so it can be provisioned through what is ultimately a hybrid sort of human/digital interaction process. And that's something that we've obviously built over the course of the last sort of 3-4 years. But it's what does differentiate us. Notwithstanding, we can do lots of above the line, or we could spend a heap of money on marketing the sort. But at the end of the day, that customer experience that we see coming through our platform, through the various ways we measure customer experience, that's particularly now that we're getting a lot better at measuring all that. That's kind of what really gives me the confidence with respect to us knowing that we're on the right path, dealing with the troughs and having that eternal optimism that Paul mentioned. We've now actually got, I guess, the data points that even point to, or justify that optimism as well.
Sure. In terms of success for, I guess, looking at your examples with ToyBox and with Moula, ToyBox, I'm not sure about your background, but I'm assuming that you don't have this huge sort of passion for toys. I might be wrong.
Other than being an eternal child.
But with Moula, obviously, you spent over 15 years, essentially doing that within a corporate environment. How important was experience, or how irrelevant was that experience in kind of building up ToyBox and Moula?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I did have some toy experience prior to ToyBox.
Right.
It wasn't like I looked at the market and said, "Oh, there's a gap in the toy market." At that point in time, in e-commerce land, there actually weren't many verticals. Most people had taken a more broad-based approach. But it was a function of the fact that I worked in a toy wholesaler, and I knew the difference between a Furby and a Barbie, and that helped. Hence ToyBox, and having that back-end relationship was obviously critical. So that was very important, albeit on a very sort of on a smaller scale. Now, in terms of lending, or any fintech related business, what I've noticed out there is most of the entrepreneurs or most of the people who are embarking upon these roles have come out of finance. And I think in a vertical like this, it is kind of essential, and it's no different than people starting biotechs have medical experience, and you probably see it in most verticals today because it is a more competitive landscape out there. So for me, having credit experience, and specifically underwriting experience, was essential to what we did at Moula. And again, keep in mind, we wanted to do something that was quite unique and relevant to, again, a non-comprehensive credit reporting regime. And that meant doing away with sort of traditional methodology around lending, and particularly the methodology that comes out of the US and Europe. So because we weren't just relying on bureau data, and because we weren't just relying on bank transaction data to underwrite, particularly for bigger underwrites, we needed to apply a different sort of mindset that hadn't really evolved at the point in time we started Moula. And that's why, as a business, Moula was so early on to the Xero API, and obviously had very early dealings with Xero and Chris Reed and all his team, because we needed another data source to ultimately get us to a point where we had comfort making a lend. Now, it's not to say we just use accounting data. We use bank transaction data, and the whole sort of breadth of data that we use now has become a lot more complex. But I don't think we could have gone along that journey if we didn't have the backgrounds that we did have. And it's safe to say we're now getting to a point where we've had that sort of formative period of utilising our credit capability to build out an underwriting platform, of which Andrew and I were effectively responsible for. And it almost feels like it's outgrown us to an extent now. And we are getting to a point where the data sets are becoming so complicated that we need people who are a lot smarter than me to sift through and find the correlations and do all of that good stuff, both from an underwriting perspective and from a lead gen perspective, which is great. That's what you want to see. It's sort of there's growth in the platform, and it's outgrown the founders. But not having that experience would have made it almost impossible.
Sure. And finally, speaking of that growth, what are some of the the less talked about challenges of scaling the company? And what have you found the most difficult as you've grown Moula?
Yeah, I think one of the things that doesn't get touched on a lot, and particularly over the last few years, we hear a lot about lots of venture capital funds and lots of liquidity coming into the venture space in Australia. And you mentioned Paul and what he's doing at Rampersam, and there's a whole raft of people doing some really good stuff out there. And what doesn't necessarily get touched on a lot is how to sort of manage that cap raise process, and the significant burden it can have on a business when you're trying to be very selective about your stakeholders. And as you said before, you actually you gave money back because of your obligation to those stakeholders, and that's definitely been the journey we've been on. So it is a function of finding the right people to have on that journey. It's not just a question of can I raise the funds, and I say it's not spoken about because I think so people are focused on can I get the money in the door? Let me Google the top 20 venture capital firms in Australia and I'll go speak to all 20 of them. That's easy, and most of them are very accommodating. Paul will take an email. The various other funds, they'll all be responsive to good ideas. But then, the diligence process should be just as much about you doing the diligence as it should be the other way around. And I think people do forget that. And we've been fortunate, and I'll say some of it's been calculated and some of it, we just got really lucky. And we've ended up with stakeholders who are extremely supportive and have sort of managed, gone through the experience with us, and managed us through that process to the point where, the outcome has been something we've all been really happy with. And that's just that's a challenge only because it takes time. It's exhausting going through that process and not just saying yes to the first person, as you mentioned. And so that's probably one really key learning through our experience. The other one I would say is absolutely critical. And again, it is sometimes your investors do have an influence upon this, is how you manage your growth. So away from the sort of the team dynamics and the market dynamics and all that good stuff that we've spoken about, but how you manage your growth, particularly for a business like ours, which is a lending business. We're not a SaaS solution. We're not just trying to get our average run rate to 10 million a month or whatever the case might be. Like, lending businesses are fundamentally different in that regard, because if I wanted to go downstairs and stand on the corner of Burke Street and give money away, it wouldn't be that difficult. Most people would probably take $1,000, $2,000 off me without working too hard for it. The challenge for a business like ours is obviously getting the money back. So how do you manage growth, i.e. how do you manage a growing loan book whilst ensuring you still keep your underwriting criteria really conservative and sensible? And I guess that's been, it doesn't get spoken about a lot because it's very unique to a business like Moula. But it should be unique to every lending platform out there in the fintech space, is how do you grow your business sustainably for the long term? And that's been a real challenge, particularly in light of all the noise and all the competition you mentioned. There's a lot of people out there talking about growing loan books and hitting certain milestones and the sort, where for us it's just been about managed growth and playing the very long game. And I think that's been it's been hard. It's been a challenge, but we've sort of gotten the business to a point now where we can be pretty comfortable with our run rate and our growth rate. So we're well and truly focused on that long game versus perhaps some of the shorter games that are typically played in particularly in the technology industry.
Sure. Just going back to your early point to wrap up. I think, as you kind of mentioned, a lot of the time, like, I've run businesses where it's felt like I'm just constantly trying to push things uphill and you're just looking for those opportunities. But when you kind of hit the nail on the head, and, I've interviewed a lot of founders, and kind of some of the things that I'm sort of doing now as well, a lot of those opportunities will start coming to you. And as you mentioned, the hard part is how do you sift through that and not say yes to the first thing? What, specifically from the investors or stakeholders that you were sort of mentioning about, what is it that you were looking for from those stakeholders to know that was a good sort of partnership or a good sort of stakeholder for you to bring on? Yeah,
I think it depends on where you're at in the life cycle of your business, because some investors, some stakeholders are absolutely critical in the early days. So finding a good angel that's going to be supportive without being too supportive is absolutely critical. People you can trust, that have your best interests in heart, at heart, I should say. That's critical. But then you get to a point in the business where whilst you still want someone there who's going to have your best interests at heart, you really want them to probably be less supportive and a lot more critical of what you're doing. So you get to that sort of later stage of the business where you want to go to a board meeting. And when that sort of 90 minutes, 2 hours, however long you dedicate to your board meetings is over, you want to feel like you've been through the ringer. And if you walk out of those board meetings and you're all happy and relaxed, something's horribly wrong. So that's kind of, you want to bring in investors who are well and truly going to question everything you're doing within the business, whether it's channel related, whether it's tech related, whether it's hiring related. And it's safe to say we've gotten to a point now where all the respective founders we've brought into the business, not founders, board members we've brought in and stakeholders are well and truly motivated to be critical. And I love that. And I wouldn't change that for the world. But as I say, you kind of need to go from someone who's a bit nurturing and supportive to the real critical aspect. And then I think your business starts to get to a point where you want to start bringing in investors who are perhaps a bit more, a bit more sort of, call it traditional financial investors. Broaden out your register. So it's not just about people sitting on your board, but people who are supportive from an ongoing financial context, if you will. So there's all of these different sort of complementary parts of the stakeholder base that you can bring into the business that, depending on where you're at, will have fundamentally different roles. And when I say financial investors, I'm talking more about funds, be it VC or otherwise. And they have a role to play, as do your sort of more early stage investors as well. And building out that register, is just as critical to a business's growth as is the day-to-day, because they're going to support the day-to-day as well. And again, that's why having a nice clear delineation of roles within the team, so one person can manage one facet and the other manage the other facet, absolutely critical.
Fantastic. On that note, Aris, thanks so much for your time and for sharing your insights today. For anyone that wants to find out more, get in touch, say hello, what's the best way for them to do that?
That's a very good question. So there is Twitter, as I hear a lot of your podcasters refer to. So tweet me on just hashtag Aris, not hashtag, at Aris Allegos, not hashtag. You can hashtag me as well if you want. And that's probably the best way to get me. Other than that, I think I'm generally at a lot of the Melbourne-based events as well. So by all means, don't be shy. Come up, say hello.
And Moula's on social?
Moula's on social. So we are at Moula Money. So that's another way to hit us via Twitter. We're on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn. By all means, drop me a LinkedIn note as well. More than happy to sort of come back and have a general tete-a-tete.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. Aris, once again, thanks for your time and for sharing your story today.
Awesome. Thank you, Rohit.
Yes. Thanks for listening to episode 55 of the Startup Playbook Podcast. You can find the show notes of my interview with Aris, along with a curated list of tools and resources for startup founders at startupplaybook.co. As always, you can join the conversation through our Twitter account. The handle is @PlaybookStartup. Next week, I will be publishing my live podcast interview with Vicky Lay, the Managing Director of Artesian Venture Partners. There are still a few tickets left to the event on Monday the 3rd of July, and you can register for the event by heading to tinyurl.com/playbookvicky. I'll also include the link in the show notes for this episode at startupplaybook.co. Don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date with our latest episodes. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you at episode 56 next week.